The story of American convert Robert Dickson Crane, initially disgusted with Islam. Robert Dickson Crane. He is a convert from the United States who initially thought Islam was very bad. I never thought about Islam seriously. All I knew about Islam was that good Muslims had to kill Christians, and that Muslim heaven was like a brothel. I was so sick of it, he said. Stephen Barbosa, in his book entitled American Jihad, Islam After Malcolm X, said that Robert Dickson Crane was a graduate of Harvard Law School. He served as foreign policy advisor to President Richard Nixon from 1963 to 1968, and for a very short time was deputy director of the National Security Council during the Nixon administration, as well as being President Reagan's ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, UAE. Subsequently, Crane led the legal section of the Muslim American Council. This organization, which is based in Washington, D.C., coordinates activities spread throughout the world to firmly oppose discrimination against Muslims, raise political awareness among Muslims, and form consensus on key issues that exist in Muslim society. He developed a new strategy to embed Islamic thought in a systematic and professional manner into contemporary policy forms in Washington. The basic thinking is theological. Islam does not separate sacred and religious things from secular things. He and other Islamic traditionalists, says Stephen Barbosa, argue that Christians regard creation or the world as a sinful act and evil, and depict faith as the only salvation. Likewise, Buddhism considers creation or the world to be evil, and salvation only comes through the renunciation of lust. In Islam, on the other hand, creation or the world is considered something good and is proof of God's power and greatness. And the role of humans is to manage this creation in an ethical way so that it can serve human needs. In 2011, Crane was recruited by the world's largest think tank, the Qatar Foundation in the state of Qatar, to teach a course on how policy is made in Washington. When he arrived on January 1, 2012, he was reassigned to full professorship and director of a new research center at Qatar's Faculty of Islamic Studies, entitled Center for the Study of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies, tasked with studying the origins, state-of-the-art, and future scenarios for what called the Arab Spring. On January 1, 2014, Crane was appointed Professor Emeritus for 18 months to complete his 4-volume textbook, Islam and Muslims, Essence and Practice, as a model and part of a proposal for the Center for Holistic Education to produce an edited textbook on Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and indigenous religions by spiritual scholars in these world religions. The Cherokee family. Crane talks about his Cherokee family tree, its roots stretching back to 17th century England, as well as mental strategy diplomacy, the corridors of power, and a banquet in Bahrain that changed his thinking about Islam. The Crane family came to New Haven, Connecticut in 1636. Some of them settled in Elizabethtown, now Elizabeth, New Jersey. The following is Crane's complete confession, as quoted in the book translated by Suderman Tiba and Fethia Basri into American-Style Jihad, Islam After Malcolm X, Mizan, 1995. On my mother's side flows the blood of Europeans who came to America in 1608 aboard the second ship that went to Jamestown. The ship was full of prisoners. My mother's family were debtors who were released from prison on the condition that they work for 7 years in a colonial country. It's almost like a death sentence. I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. My father taught economics at Harvard for 10 years. My father's own father didn't make it past 6th form. In fact, he was a bum in the 80s and 90s of the last century. He left home after 6th grade and wandered for 12 years. He married my grandmother, who was from an Indian tribe, grandmothers decided that their children should get a good education. His 2 sons earned doctoral degrees, and his 2 daughters earned bachelor's degrees. They were the first generation to emerge from the wanderings and dirty farms of South Central Indiana. My mother's family is very rich. My grandmother's father was one of the financial supporters of Northwestern University. My mother called my father a barbarian. They couldn't live together, 2 people who had completely different views on life. For one, the only problem is money, and for others, the only thing that matters is living a good life and being content with one's lot. I went to Harvard, then dropped out and went to baccalaureate at Northwestern. My family wants me to be president of the family hardware company. I work there 20 hours a week. I learned everything from the ground up. Then my family asked me to continue studying at Harvard Law School. They reckon that it is better than getting a baccalaureate degree. Then I studied at Harvard Law, but I changed my mind. They wanted me to study there to get an educational background that would enable me to control the company, but I went there to study justice issues. When I was at Cambridge, I wrote about Soviet space strategy. When the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out, I wrote a long article on psychic warfare strategies. I already suspected that the Soviets would win the missile crisis. Everyone thought that the United States would subdue them, but it was clear to me that Khrushchev's goal was not to intimidate or use his missiles against the United States. The goal was to consolidate communist power in Cuba. The method was to install the missiles, then withdraw them with a guarantee of America's commitment not to interfere in Fidel Castro's affairs, which is what actually happened. What Khrushchev had to believe was that Kennedy would not put his finger on that button, and it would not escape his observation. Khrushchev really miscalculated, because Kennedy suffered from fear of nuclear war. He calculated that if he did not immediately remove the missiles from there, the situation would escalate, and nuclear war might result. If you are very afraid of nuclear war, you must take firm steps. So he was willing to take the risk to avoid further confrontation. If they can convince the American people that there is real danger, then they can manipulate us, and we cannot imagine a post-nuclear war scenario. Medium they can. Nixon's advisor. I studied the Soviet orchestration of American thought, and Richard Nixon read it on a plane from California to New York. He called me soon after landing, in January 1963, and asked if I would be his advisor on foreign policy. We divided the world into areas and subjects. Then I would study professional magazines to find the best articles on each subject. Then I regularly combined all the articles into a summary book for him to read, because he was a very fond reader. Nixon was interested in reading about various religions, and he wanted to know about Islam. At that time, I had read a little about Islam, because I thought Islam would be the strongest and most durable ally of the United States against communism. Because both of us, Nixon and I, saw communism as a world threat. At that time, from 1963 to 1966, I urged Nixon to return to office. I also advised Gerald Ford on various magazines, and I also advised major Republican leaders. After the election in 1966, 10 new congressmen were elected. A feeling of confidence in the Republican Party emerged. I was invited as a Republican defense expert to provide briefings on defense issues to all the new Republican members of Congress. We held those briefing sessions over 3 days. Soon after that, I went to Nixon's office. There was Pat Nixon busy writing addresses on Christmas cards. Usually he sends 200 or 300 cards, but at that time his office was full of thousands of cards, and I said, "Ah, fantastic, the boss is running again." Pat said, "Yes, and I have a terrible feeling that he's going to destroy himself." I said, "Hey, you've got to be kidding. That makes absolutely no sense. He said, I know, but he will destroy himself. He was so worried about Nixon's desire to run. When I think back, I think he saw two personalities in Nixon. One, his real personality. You couldn't find anyone better than Nixon. The other is his personality that emerges when he is struggling for power, because he is on the wrong path but wants to succeed. That's why he pulled Henry Kissinger, to gain credibility with what I took to be a secular government. That's what caused the Watergate case. The wrong personality emerged. While fighting for power, he became a street fighter, and the good Nixon simply disappeared. And I think that's what Pat Nixon knew, that this would happen, as it did, when he reached the White House. Kissinger got rid of me during the 1968 campaign. He assigned me to write 5 papers on 5 major foreign policy issues. I did 50 pages each. That's how Kissinger avoided his opponents. He will keep them busy. I bound the 5 papers into one book, and Gerard Ford wrote an interesting introduction. Ford called me in and said, "You can publish your book with my introduction, but I want to make a comment. On every consideration of each of these major issues, which are written in the book, you and Kissinger completely disagree. For your sake yourself, don't publish this book. Just forget your opinions. Go ahead and do what you've been told." But I still say what I think. Nixon appointed me Deputy Director of Planning for the National Security Council. But the director was Kissinger. Then I came to work. They showed me where I was on the staff. The next day I came again but found that I had been removed. I was fired by Kissinger after 1 day's work. Kissinger had no choice. You have to work with people who will support you. So he fired me. Disgusting religion. I have never had the desire to study Islam. This religion is very primitive. And I advised Nixon to use Islam as an ally against the communists. I think Islam is a disgusting religion, but at the very least it can be used to fight communism. But then, in the summer of 1977, I was in Bahrain. The temperature was well above 100 degrees. My wife wanted to see Al-Muharraq, which is the oldest trading city, which only consists of narrow alleys, like a chaotic network of streets, and deliberately made to keep pirates away from raiding. We wanted to see the palaces of trading princes in the middle of the city of Al-Muharraq. We got lost in the crowd, and I felt like I was going to faint. I was probably unconscious for 2 or 3 minutes. There was an old man passing by and he knew I was in trouble. He took us to his house, which was across the street. We spent the rest of the day there. We chatted while eating. We talked about various things, and he said he was Muslim. I was really blown away because he was a really good person. We never talked about Islam. We talk about what is good in the world, about what is bad in the world, and about what is important in the world. Also about God's role in the world, but not about the Islamic religion. I thought, this is really strange. This guy talks about everything I believe, but he said he was a Muslim. There must be something wrong. I concluded that I should start studying Islam. It was obvious that I had been brainwashed. I studied the religion and realized that everything in Islam was exactly what I had always believed. But I don't like the rule of bowing, ruku. To me, that's disgusting. You only bow to a king or someone honorable, and I will not bow to anyone else. I attended a conference on Islamic movements in 1980 in New Hampshire. All the great thinkers from the world Islamic movement were present there. As it neared noon, the other Americans came down for lunch, and I wanted to eat lunch with the foreign guests because I wanted to learn as much as I could from them. And on our way downstairs, we entered a room whose floor was covered with a rug. I think we'll have lunch. Then I remembered that it was Friday. They will perform Friday prayers. I decided it would be best to leave them. but I think that would offend them. Then I just sat at the back of the room. The Imam is Hassan al-Turabi. At that time, and to this day, he is the most prominent Muslim in the world. When he prostrated, my mind was blown. He prostrated himself to Allah. I haven't really experienced it yet. All I saw was bowing, worshipping. But then I realized that he was bowing to Allah. And if he could bow to Allah, then that means he was 10 times better than me. I decided that I too should prostrate, at that moment. Well, that's how I became a Muslim. I got an example from him. ABA President. I was elected president for the Muslim American Bar Association. This association is very necessary. I would like to change it to the American Bar Association, to highlight key issues from an Islamic perspective. The ABA does everything that Muslims should do, but Muslims do not participate in it. There is no overarching paradigm for ABA. Muslims have the same overall paradigm as that of the American founders, and our task is to revive that pure paradigm. Namely, that truth comes from God, not created by humans, and that truth is the only source of justice. Truth that comes from a higher source. Through reading nature, through revelation, the 3 revealed religions. Because truth originates from this source, justice is an expression of this truth, and justice is described by Islamic scholars in the form of human rights or human responsibility. The 6 main rights are life, equality, private property, political freedom, dignity, and the freedom and duty to seek knowledge. Within each of these elements, there are subsections that must be followed. And based on that, we can develop specific policies in the fields of education, law, personal property rights, whatever subject matter. We have identified more than 100 Muslim lawyers in the United States, but I am sure there are hundreds more. Immigrant lawyers in their 30s or older do not want to defend Muslims. They don't want to tarnish their reputation. They don't want to be known as Muslim lawyers. Many younger generations want to become lawyers, and they want to be socially active. It is clear that there is a lot of prejudice in our justice system against Muslims. For example, in Alaska, a priest was beaten black and blue by security guards at the Anchorage airport. They left his hands disabled for life, his ribs broken. He got a defense attorney and finally won his case after 4 years. They convicted the police of wrongly arresting him and proved the priest's innocence, but his defense was so poor that the jury refused to award him compensation for his medical expenses. If he had a good lawyer to compromise with, he could have won the case in 6 months instead of 4 years. And he probably would have gotten $1 million. And he said he would give the money to a legal defense fund. He was a typical example where Muslims are just losers in the American legal system, so we formed the American Muslim Legal Defense Association to handle personal cases. We need a general movement of traditionalists to rally both parties to participate in all institutions in America. I do not consider myself a supporter of the Republican or Democratic parties, because I believe that we should work within all parties. Religious vacuum. There is basically a religious vacuum in our institutions, in the fields of media, education, government, even in the field of justice. All of this has been secularized steadily throughout the past century, in complete conflict with the First Amendment, which was designed not to keep religion out of public life, but to keep the government out of religion. The assumption of almost all of America's founding fathers was that no society could prosper unless that society was based on morality, and that morality was based on a transcendent source. People argue that Jefferson was an atheist. They call him the father of American secularism. On the contrary, he couldn't even imagine a secular America. He said that the key to democracy is education. The essence of education is moral education, virtue, and it must be based on a higher source than mere human thought. He believed in democracy in the sense that the people who govern are subjects who must have a higher morality based on a higher source. Our public institutions adhere to secular ideology, but the public does not. And this is a real American problem. Because we will never reach consensus as long as there remains a gap between the people and the governing institutions. The assumption of all America's founders was that it was a great experiment to see if a society could be led by men guided by God. And until now, we have still failed in this experiment.